Mary screamed, like her entire world was being ripped away from her. It wasn't just a cry, it was raw and soul shaking, the kind of sound that makes everyone stop and stare. Her 9-year-old son, Ken, sat in the back of the police cruiser, his small face pressed against the window, watching her collapse to her knees in the snow. Even now, years later, Ken can still hear that scream, replaying it in his mind, wondering how everything went so wrong, so fast. It all started back in Nigeria, where life wasn't easy for Mary and her husband Victor. They lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Ibadan with their only son, Ken. Victor had been a respected banker before he lost his job during a round of layoffs. With no steady income, the family struggled. Mary did whatever she could to keep food on the table, selling bean cake by the roadside in the mornings and sewing clothes late into the night. They were barely getting by, but they were happy because they had each other. Victor never let the tough times crush his hope. Despite the struggles, they were happy. Victor always told stories about how things would get better. Ken, he'd say, patting his son on the head, "One day, you'll go to a good school, become a great man, and make us proud." Ken always believed him. One ordinary afternoon, everything changed. Victor and Mary had entered the American visa lottery years ago, and they had forgotten about it. Mary was checking her email at an internet cafe when she saw it. An email saying they had won the American visa lottery. For a moment, she thought it was a scam. But when she realized it was real, she screamed so loudly that the other customers came rushing over to see if she was okay. "Victor, we're going to America," she shouted as she got home, tears running down her face. It was the answer to their prayers. The months before their departure were a whirlwind of selling off belongings, saying goodbye to family and friends, and preparing for a life they had only dreamed about. Victor and Mary sold most of their belongings to afford the plane tickets and the visa fees. "We're starting a new life," Victor said, over and over, trying to convince himself as much as his family. Victor and Mary were determined to give Ken a better future. "America is where dreams come true," they told him. The day they boarded the plane was the happiest day of their lives, and the flight to the United States was an adventure for Ken. It was his first time on a plane, and he couldn't stop staring out the window. Mary held his hand tightly as the plane took off, her eyes glistening with both hope and fear of the unknown. "Ken, this is the start of something big," Victor said, smiling at his wife and son, and his eyes full of hope. When they landed in the United States, everything felt different. The air was cold, and the buildings were taller than anything they had ever seen. They stayed in a small motel for a few weeks while Mary and Victor looked for jobs and a permanent place to live. It didn't take long for reality to hit. Victor, who had been a banker back in Nigeria before he lost his job, couldn't find a job in his field. "They want banking experience in America," he told Mary, frustration clear in his voice. He started working as a security guard at night, while Mary got a job cleaning houses during the day. They finally moved into a tiny apartment with peeling walls and a leaky ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Victor and Mary worked tirelessly, taking shifts so that one of them was always home with Ken. Mary always said, "Ken, you're why we're doing all this. We want you to have a better future." Ken started school, and it wasn't easy. The other kids made fun of his accent and the way he dressed. "Why do you talk like that?" they'd ask, laughing. But Mary always told Ken to focus on his books. "Ignore them," she'd say. "You're going to be great one day." One cold winter morning, everything fell apart. Victor had just finished his night shift and was too tired to take Ken to school. Mary, who was running late for a cleaning job, decided to drop Ken off on her way. They stopped at a gas station because she needed to grab something quickly. "Ken, stay in the car. I'll be back in 2 minutes," she said. She left the heater on and locked the doors. Ken didn't think much of it. Back in Nigeria, it wasn't unusual for kids to wait in the car while their parents ran errands. But here, it was different. A woman parked next to them noticed Ken sitting alone. She looked at Ken for a long time, her face twisting with concern, or maybe judgment. Then she pulled out her phone. Minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. They knocked on the car window, asking Ken to unlock the door. Ken shook his head, scared and confused. "Where are your parents?" one of them asked. When Mari came out of the store, her face turned pale. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. The officers accused her of endangering her son by leaving Ken alone in the car. Mari tried to explain, her Nigerian accent thick with panic. "I was only inside for a minute. The car was warm. He was safe." But they didn't listen. They called Child Protective Services, and before Mary knew it, they were taking Ken away. Mary was sobbing, screaming, and begging them not to take Ken. "Please, he's my son. Don't do this." Ken remembers her face as they drove him away. It was the first time he'd ever seen his mom cry so deeply. She stood there, helpless, confused, and kept screaming his name. When Mary got home that day, she was barely able to open the door. Her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped her keys twice before she could unlock it. As soon as she stepped inside, she collapsed onto the couch, her face wet with tears. Victor, who had just woken up from his post-night shift nap, rushed to her side. "Mary, what is it? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice thick with worry. But Mary couldn't speak at first. Her lips quivered, and she shook her head, struggling to catch her breath between sobs. Victor crouched down in front of her, gripping her shoulders tightly. "Ken," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Mary!" Victor's voice rose in panic. "Where is our son?" She finally managed to choke out the words. "The police. They took him," she whispered. Victor froze, as if the words didn't make sense to him. "Took him? What do you mean they took him? What happened?" Mary explained everything, her voice trembling with guilt and panic. She told him how she had left Ken in the car for just a few minutes to grab groceries, how the police had shown up, and how they refused to listen to her. "I begged them, Victor. I begged them not to take him. But they said I endangered him. They said I was a bad mother," she cried. Victor's face darkened with anger and despair. "How could they do this?" he yelled, pacing back and forth. "We came here for a better life, and this is what they do. Take our son away. For what? For nothing." Mary sat there, clutching her head, muttering, "It's all my fault. I shouldn't have left him. I didn't know. I didn't know they would do this." Victor stopped pacing and knelt in front of her again. "Mary, listen to me. This is not your fault. We didn't know how different things are here. But we'll get him back. Do you hear me? We'll get Ken back, no matter what it takes." That evening, they tried to figure out what to do. Victor called the police department, but they gave him the same response they had given Mary. "Your case is with Child Protective Services now." When he called CPS, they explained that Ken had been placed in temporary foster care while an investigation was conducted. "You'll need to attend a hearing in a few weeks," the caseworker said. "Until then, you cannot contact him." The words hit Victor like a punch to the gut. "A few weeks?" He's our son. We haven't done anything wrong, he yelled into the phone. But the caseworker remained calm, almost robotic. These are the procedures, she said before hanging up. That night, neither Mary nor Victor could sleep. Mary kept replaying the moment they took Ken away, the look of confusion and fear on his face as he called out, "Mama!" Victor sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, his fists clenched. The next morning, Victor took action. He started making calls, reaching out to anyone who might help. A family friend, a community leader, even a pastor at their church. But no one seemed to know what to do. Meanwhile, Mary felt paralyzed by guilt. She stopped eating and barely spoke. "What if they don't give him back, Victor?" she whispered one night. "What if we lose him forever?" Victor shook his head firmly. "We won't. I'll fight for him, Mary. I don't care what it takes." He began researching. He spent hours at the library and on borrowed computers at the community center, trying to understand how the system worked. He read everything he could about CPS, foster care, and legal rights. Through a church connection, he found a local advocacy group that helped immigrant families. One of their volunteers introduced Victor to a lawyer named Mr. Green. Victor and Mary met with Mr. Green in his small, cluttered office. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who listened intently as they told their story. Mary broke down several times during the meeting, and Victor had to pick up where she left off. When they finished, Mr. Green leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first time I've heard a story like this," he said. "The system here doesn't always understand cultural differences. What's normal in your country can be seen as neglect here. But you're not bad parents. You just made a mistake, and I believe we can prove that." He explained what they needed to do: attend parenting classes, show proof of steady employment, and demonstrate that their home was a safe environment for Ken. It sounded overwhelming, but Victor and Mary were willing to do whatever it took. "I'll help you prepare for the hearing," Mr. Green said. "But I won't lie to you. This won't be easy. The system is slow and it's not always fair. But if you're determined, we'll fight this together." The next few weeks were a blow for Ken. He was placed in foster care with strangers who didn't look like him, didn't speak his language, and didn't understand his culture. He was scared and confused. His first foster parents were nice enough, but it wasn't home. He missed his parents. The Johnsons were not bad. They gave Ken toys, fed him well, and tried to make him feel at home, but it wasn't home. He cried himself to sleep every night, clutching the blanket his mom had left on the car seat that day. He missed her cooking, her stories, and the way she would sing while they cleaned the house. Weeks turned into months, and every visit with his parents in supervised settings left them in tears. Victor and Mary told Ken they were fighting to get him back, but the system didn't make it easy. One day, out of nowhere, Ken was told he'd be moving to a new foster home. The Johnsons weren't fostering anymore. Ken didn't even get to say goodbye. The second home was different, colder. The Smiths didn't talk to Ken much. They had 3 other foster kids, and it felt like Ken was just another mouth to feed. The foster dad would yell at them for small things, like leaving a toy on the floor or not eating fast enough. Once, he grabbed Ken by the arm so hard it left a bruise. Ken told his caseworker, but nothing happened. She said she would look into it. Weeks later, he was moved again. By the time Ken was placed with the Millers, he had learned not to trust anyone. Mr. Miller seemed nice at first. He gave Ken extra snacks and let him watch cartoons. But at night, his behavior changed. He would yell at Mrs. Miller for hours. Sometimes, Ken heard things breaking. One night, he went into Ken's room, sat on the edge of the bed, and started asking questions about Ken's mom. "Do you think she's ever getting you back?" he asked. Ken didn't answer. He just pretended to be asleep. The next morning, Mrs. Miller helped Ken pack his things. She said he'd be leaving. Ken later learned that another foster kid had reported Mr. Miller for being abusive, and the state was investigating. At Ken's fourth foster home, he met the Thompsons. They were kind and patient, and for the first time, he felt very safe. They encouraged him to talk about his parents and even helped him write letters to them, though Ken wasn't allowed to send them. Meanwhile, during those weeks, Victor and Mary felt a small glimmer of hope. They threw themselves into the process, attending every class, submitting every document, and following every instruction Mr. Green gave them. Victor worked extra shifts to pay for the legal fees, while Mary spent hours cleaning and organizing their apartments to make sure it met CPS's standards. But the hardest part was the waiting. Every day without Ken felt like a lifetime. Mary would sit in his room, holding his favorite toy and crying silently. Victor would come home late at night, exhausted but determined, and sit beside her. "We'll bring him home," he'd say, even when he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. After a few months, they finally got their day in court. Ken was also allowed to attend. Seeing his parents after so long felt like a dream. They looked older, more tired, but when they saw Ken, their face lit up. The lawyer argued that Mary and Victor weren't neglectful, just misunderstood. He explained how cultural differences and their struggles as immigrants had been used against them. He showed the judge how hard Mary and Victor had worked to meet every requirement, how much they loved their only child, and how unfair it was to punish them for a cultural misunderstanding. The judge ruled in their favor, and Ken was finally allowed to go home. Mary hugged Ken so tightly he could barely breathe. "You're home now," she said. "You're home." Looking back now as an adult, Ken often thinks about that time. He talks to his parents about it sometimes, how one small misunderstanding nearly destroyed their family. But through it all, they never stopped fighting for Ken. Their love and determination brought him back home, and for that, he'll always be grateful. This story isn't just about what happened to Ken. It's about the strength of family, the challenges immigrants face, and the love that can overcome even the darkest moments. How did the family's journey make you feel? Could you relate to any part of their struggles? And what do you think is the most important lesson from Ken's story? Please share your insights in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more educative and inspiring stories. Don't forget to also share with family and friends to spread the message. Thank you.